So, the US election is just 10 days out, and many are saying this is as close as it can get. Less than a point separates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, but new polls just in the last few hours, just in the last couple of days or so, has seemingly suggested that Donald Trump is now beating Kamala Harris even on the popular vote. Up until this week, Kamala Harris was leading in the popular vote, but she had a tough time in the battleground states or the swing states, which ultimately will decide who becomes the next president. But now, new polling is showing that Donald Trump is edging past Kamala Harris even in the popular vote. Now, what that means is that if that is true, if these polls hold, it shows that Donald Trump is the one who has momentum going into election day. You want to be the candidate who has momentum going into election day. And more importantly, because of the inherent bias in the Electoral College system, which the Democrats say does not favor them, which means that if Trump is ahead on the popular vote, then in the Electoral College, we are potentially looking at an electoral landslide. But let's try and make sense of this from both sides of the divide, as it were. First, I want to go across to Mr. David Schultz. He's an American pollster. Thank you very much, Mr. Schultz. First things first, everyone wants to know, and obviously there's a huge amount of interest here in India and around the world as far as the US presidential election is concerned. Why is this race so close? They're saying it's the closest election perhaps since Bush v. Gore, and that was 25 years ago. Why has this election become so close?
Well, the election has become so close because America is so politically divided at this point. Had we gone back 2 years ago, right after our midterm elections, back when it was still Trump versus Biden, the election was very, very close. And except for that brief period of time in June after the Trump-Biden debate and up until, let's say, just a few weeks ago, it's been more or less an incredibly stable electorate and stable in the polls for the last 2 years because we are just so divided. We are so polarized, and the partisanship in terms of, again, party loyalty of who people are going to vote for is so rigid at this point. And that explains it really at this point, really in the United States. We are a divided country that remains divided, and there's almost nobody who's really undecided at this point in this election for a period of a long time. And what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks is that this election is going to come down to probably less about changing people's opinions about who to vote for and more about whether certain people show up to vote.
So tell me, Mr. Schultz, just in the last couple of weeks or so, polls are showing that whatever gap there was between Trump and Harris, Trump is managing to close that gap. It was under 1% at the start of this week, and now we have new polling which shows that Trump is ahead on the popular vote. When it was about a month or so back, right after the debate, and it was a good debate for Harris, she was leading on average in most of the polls, at least in the popular vote, by above 2 percentage points. But the fact that Trump has managed to close that gap, do you reckon that that is indicative of anything? Do you reckon that that shows that Trump is the one who has momentum? He's the guy who's got tailwind behind him going into these last 10 days or so. Does that change anything at all? How big a factor is that on election day itself?
It potentially has an impact. But again, remember, we need to focus on the fact that we don't elect the president of the United States by the straight popular vote or national popular vote. It's really by the Electoral College. And what this election's really coming down to is, as I've been arguing for months, it's about what 150,000 to 200,000 voters are going to do in about 6 or 7 states in the United States. And what we mean by states, this election is going to come down to voters in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina. So the real question is there momentum for Trump versus Harris in those critical swing states? And in those critical swing states, the election does seem to be dead even. Perhaps maybe at this point, a little bit of momentum shifting towards Trump. But what we're going to look at in these next 2 weeks is really to the extent to which both candidates are going to work hard on just getting out their base, getting out their supporters. And really this election will be determined by which of the two sides is better at mobilizing their base. And if the shift in opinion is potentially an indication of, let's say, the enthusiasm factor for a candidate, perhaps Trump has an edge. And that's where I am at right now. When I look at the numbers, when I look at the polling data, I think it's a slight advantage to Trump right now.
So tell me, if you're saying that all of this is boiling down to who turns out the base on election day, then why is there so much time and money spent by the campaigns and the candidates on what they call the undecideds? It's almost like the undecideds decide this election.
Well, the undecided ones are probably not truly undecided. And what I mean by that, they're not saying, am I going to vote for Trump versus Harris? There's an incredibly small number of those people who are out there. What we're really looking at are voters now. Are they going to show up to vote or not show up to vote? That's how I'm really sort of classifying the undecideds. And so, yes, Trump and Harris are trying to locate those few that out there that are on the fence, that can't decide between the two of them. But more likely what they're looking at are individuals who they think are their supporters, who they want to make sure they're going to show up to vote on election day versus concern that if they don't show up and vote on election day. So that really is the focus. I think the other thing that's going on right now is that we're seeing just this intense amount of advertising in the closing 2 weeks of the election. Again, I don't think it's going to change anybody's name or change anybody's opinions, but what it's going to do is perhaps, again, mobilize people, get them to show up to vote. That's really the focus right now.
Because you're saying that that is really what will decide this election, who turns out the base more. The conventional wisdom has been, at least in the last couple of election cycles, we've seen this, is that the Democrats are better at turning out the vote. They have a better ground game, so to speak. And of course, Kamala Harris also has outraised money, by a couple of times against Donald Trump, maybe even 5x or 10x. But do you think ultimately that will make a difference in these half a dozen or so battleground states?
That's clearly the case at this point. It's really shifted to the ground game. All indications are that Harris has a better ground game as the Democrat and is doing a better job mobilizing, but she also has a difficulty in the sense that one of the groups that she needs to mobilize are voters under the age of 30 in the United States. And in the United States, what we call these younger voters are very hard to mobilize, to encourage them to get out the vote. It's difficult to reach them, to contact them. Many of them have not voted before. And so her challenge is getting a ground game that can get these younger voters to show up on election day. And in fact, where I am in terms of where my analysis right now is that if Harris is successful in mobilizing large numbers of people under the age of 30 to vote, she wins the election. If she's not successful in doing that, then Trump wins the election. And so for her, good ground game is important, but the people that she needs to mobilize are very, very difficult to reach and to actually get them to show up to vote.
Well, as you say, it's very difficult to get Gen Z to be interested in politics. They are expectedly tuned out of politics. But finally, as we conclude, what is your analysis or your best estimate as things stand today? We're less than 2 weeks out from the election. Who might scrape through on election night?
First off, right now, I think there's a slight advantage to Donald Trump. That if we go back to the undecided voters, if it matters here, there's about 2% of the voters in the critical swing states are undecided. Generally, if undecided voters decide to vote, they break against the incumbent, which here would be Kamala Harris. If that's true, it looks like Trump might have a slight advantage. But this is going to be, again, a very close election. Our election is on November 5th. Do not anticipate that we will know on November 5th who the winner is, because there are several states like Pennsylvania which do early voting but don't count the ballots till after Election Day. So we're going to have an approximate idea on November 5th. It's probably going to take a few more days after that. But right now, if I were sort of betting on this race, I would say slight advantage to Donald Trump to probably win the Electoral College, Kamala Harris to win the popular vote.
All right, we'll leave it at that. David Schultz, thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts and perspective. All right, so you heard from one particular side of the political divide, as it were. And even there, you heard Mr. Schultz saying that as things stand today, the advantage seems to be with Donald Trump. Let me now go across and get a Republican perspective on this. Tom Rose is a former advisor to the former Vice President, Mike Pence, and currently he is advising Donald Trump's campaign as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Rose, for speaking with us. I want to first get your thoughts as a longtime advisor for the former Vice President, Mr. Pence. The events of Jan 6th, why is there still an overhang of what happened on Jan 6, 2021, even on this election cycle? Do you think it's a big factor with the undecided voters, given how close this race is?
I don't know. It's an excellent question. I know that the Democrats want that to be a significant issue in this campaign, but if you look at polling results and if you look at responses, voters' responses to issues that are most important to them, January 6th does not even register as a significant item. I think that most Americans are far more interested in the next 4 years than they are in what happened 4 years ago. That's been litigated. Everybody has an opinion on it, on what it meant or what it didn't mean, how serious it was, or whether some of the seriousness might have been exaggerated. I think the American people are prepared to move on, and it hasn't really been a significant factor in this campaign so far. There's still 2 weeks to go.
So I guess there are a couple of reasons why that is still sort of rankling some folks. One is because neither Donald Trump nor his running mate, J.D. Vance, have said that Donald Trump actually lost in 2021 or even unequivocally condemned the violence that happened on Jan 6th. Also, among the ones who was equally critical of what happened on Jan 6th was your former boss, Mr. Pence, who did go by the book, and he has stuck by it. He has said that he believes even today that what he did on the 6th of January, certify the election, was absolutely right. Do you think that these are two reasons why this issue is perhaps even today unsettled?
I don't know, again, to push back just a little bit, I'm not sure how unsettled it is. Obviously, Joe Biden is the president. Kamala Harris is the vice president. This administration's been in office for 4 years. We do live in a democracy. There are no laws which state you have to blindly accept election results. The president relinquished power peacefully. There was a peaceful transfer of power. Many people believe, not without significant evidence, that the last election, while not quote-unquote fraudulent, had many issues that people can question. There were hundreds of very last-minute changes to election law in 2020. There were significant reductions in the ability of poll counters, election counters, to check ballots, to verify addresses and identities and that kind of thing. But I think to your earlier point, this election is about the next 4 years, not what happened 4 years ago. And I think it's very interesting that the media remains, in this country anyway, in America, remains focused on trying to pin down former President Trump and Senator Vance on whether or not they will quote-unquote accept the election results. No one asked those questions of Democrats, particularly now that it appears as though Donald Trump is going to be handily reelected again.
I do want to ask you, though, about your former boss, Vice President Pence. And in the last 4 years, have you had a chance to sort of have a conversation with him subsequent to what happened on Jan 6, what his thoughts are, whether he sticks to what he said and what he did during those tumultuous times? And also just curious to know why no mainstream establishment Republican has endorsed Donald Trump, whether it is Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz Cheney, whether it is Mitt Romney. You've heard what General Kelly, who was Donald Trump's longest serving chief of staff, what he had to say, Ambassador Bolton, who served as his national security advisor. Why none of the establishment Republicans, George W. Bush, former president, none of them have endorsed Donald Trump?
Oh, I think the Republican base has changed. I think as the Democrat Party has moved far to the left, there are significant elements of big demographic groups that have normally and traditionally been strongly Democrat that are now moving toward the Republican Party. The Latino constituency in the United States, Hispanic voters, which is by far the largest minority voting bloc in the country, has historically been very favorable to Democrats, has voted 2-1, 3-1 in favor of Democrats. There are new polls out this week, as a matter of fact, which show not only that demographic having switched, but done so pretty dramatically, that Donald Trump actually leads in early polling with Hispanics. Black voters, African American men in particular, seem to be swinging toward President Trump in ways that American election observers have not seen since 1960. That's 65 years or 64 years. So there are significant, dramatic, epochal changes in the American electorate that I believe are very favorable to President Trump, which is why I think it's quite possible he could win a very significant victory.
The Democrats, of course,
time.
Mr. Rosen, you know this, are emphasizing a lot on abortion as an issue. They think, at least according to them, this is the number one issue on the ballot, like we've seen in the 2022 midterms. And they're saying that suburban women, who used to be a significant vote bank, a significant demographic for the Republican Party, will swing away from the Republicans to the Democrats. How do you see that?
I think that's a very fair point, particularly among suburban women, unmarried women, college-educated women. Abortion is a hugely vital issue for them. I think there's been a great deal of misinformation, if you will, that Democrats have tried to inflame or encourage their voting base to focus exclusively on that. The President Trump, has indicated again and again that he will not sign a national abortion ban if it ever were to pass Congress, which it couldn't because of some of the rules of our systems over here in the United States Senate. You need 60 out of the 100 votes to move major legislation. That's all but impossible on an issue as emotional and divisive as abortion and reproductive rights. But I think you're absolutely right. Democrats certainly have an advantage on that issue, and they're trying to drive that
Home. All right.
drive that home.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Mr. Tom Rose, former advisor to the former Vice President Mike Pence and currently advising the Donald Trump campaign. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNN News 18.